Hello and welcome back. This is Dawn with another video for Picket Fence Studios. So today is kind of more of a process video. I pulled out a bunch of the supplies from their newest release and just kind of went to work without a real solid plan in place. Now there were some areas where I struggled, but I just pushed through the ugly and came out with two cards that I absolutely love. So if you're interested in seeing how these came together, keep watching. Okay, so there are a lot of really great items in this release. However, I did kind of zone in quickly on the Leaves Falling For You stamp set. I love autumn leaves. And I'm going to pair this with the Spellbinders watercolor cardstock. Now this is very similar to the Distress watercolor cardstock. However, this is just a little bit creamier in color, whereas the Distress watercolor cardstock is a bright white. So I'm going to work on the smooth side. And the first thing I'm going to do is some watercolor stamping. I do this often. It's one of my favorite techniques. So I went ahead and I pulled out some Distress Oxides, a block for stamping. In this case, I'm using the Fisker stamp press, and I will eventually switch to a smaller block to more appropriately fit each size stamp. So for my colors here, I'm using Rusty Hinge, Fossilized Amber, Gathered Twigs, and Uncharted Mariner. I happen to be obsessed with fall color palettes. Living here in Florida in the subtropics, I don't get a lot of leaves changing. We have some trees that change color, obviously, but they are just kind of dotted in between all of these evergreen trees. So it's not the show that you northerners get to see. So I guess it's that longing for seeing that. I'm kind of obsessed with it in my crafting projects. So we always want what we can't have, correct? That being said, I'm always drawn to the autumnal colors with leaves. Now here I've inked up my stamp using the paper pouncers and the Distress Oxide, and now I've sprayed it with water and I'm going to stamp this down. Now here, this first one, you can see I didn't add enough water to the stamp, or if that's the look you're going for, add less water. But you can also spray the image right after you stamp it to help activate some of that ink and get it to move around. If you want more movement in your stamped image or a less clear impression, you'd simply just add more water to your stamp like I'm doing here. And you can see that this gives you a more fluid watercolor-like look to your impression without you having to do hardly any of the work. You can continue to add more water to your stamp and stamp more images. And then once your ink seems to be depleted, or maybe your colors are over mixing together and you don't like the color that you're getting, just simply clean off your stamp, apply new color, and start over. So here I'm working on a full 8.5 by 11 piece of cardstock, and I'm going to fill this up with an all over pattern. But before I add too much, I want to try to encourage this ink to move a little bit more before it dries. You can reactivate Distress Oxides after they're dry. However, I want that nice fluid movement of the ink from the lines that I've already laid down. So I want that nice bleed of color to come out from these leaves. Occasionally, I will also use whatever's on my brush to add some splatters and such to the background, but I can't stress enough that I am not being overly particular. I'm really just getting color down, pattern, and movement. That's it. I've moved on to adding a few of the smaller images here to the background, and you can see, again, I'm not worried about getting a clean impression. I'm just putting ink on the stamp, spraying it with water, stamping it down, and then using a wet paintbrush to kind of help move some of that ink around and then add some splatters. I'm just going to continue filling up this page with the rest of the images in the set. Now you could stop at any point and then start adding in maybe some text or possibly some stencils. Add in different mediums, maybe some texture paste or heat emboss. There's a lot of different ways that you could utilize this one technique into a finished background here. Again, I just right off the bat had no ideas, and I thought this was a good starting point. So I filled up the entire background. There are many times when I looked at it and I thought, oh, I hope this is going to be usable at the end. But I knew that even if there were portions on here that I hated, I could selectively cut and crop areas and only use those. And then the areas that I didn't like so much, I could use as a mat for another panel. So none of it will really go to waste. I went ahead and finished filling up this background, dried it down, and then for my final touch, I just added some splatters of color by pushing the oxide out onto my desktop and doing some splatters. Now looking back at the footage, I think I would have preferred to have left a little bit of white space. Instead of filling this completely up, I think next time I will do a similar technique, but leave a lot of white space in there because I think it adds a resting area for the eye and places where I could add other elements. But remember, no plan. We had no plan going in. So we put this aside to dry. And then I cut this into 4 A2 card panels. So 4¼ by 5½. And you can see here when we crop these down to smaller areas, they look a little less overwhelming and a lot more interesting. So now we have 4 panels to play with. Now these are rather busy, so I knew if I was going to layer these, I needed something a little quieter, something a little less busy as a layer. So I went ahead and I did some ink smushing. I've pushed out a little bit of that Uncharted Mariner and Rusty Hinge onto a craft mat here, sprayed it with water, and then I'm just smushing another sheet of this Spellbinders watercolor cardstock into it and just creating a very soft smattering of color with a lot of white space still in it. And again, this is going to be almost, if you think of it in terms of combining patterns, you usually have a larger hero pattern, something that's very loud, and then you usually have a more subtle pattern or a smaller scale pattern to pair together. So here I have one that's very heavy in color and then one that is lighter and softer in color. So these are going to pair well together, whether I use them as panels to layer on top of each other or if I die cut from this. So again, I'm just thinking in terms of things that I can use together because I still don't have a plan at this point. I'm just putting together pieces that will complement each other in a composition. So from that, I went ahead and trimmed this down to 2 panels. So you'll see that I have 2 very heavy or louder panels, and then I have 2 softer, more muted panels. So then I did have this little piece left over and I decided to do some die cutting. They have this layering, what is this? The layering Flora fall foliage dies, and I decided to cut a couple of these from that leftover panel here. Now this again will just give me some elements that match the color and the theme of what I've already created. And around this time is when things kind of started to take shape. I really, really liked the way these die cuts looked. So I went ahead and cut several more, and then I wanted to add just a little bit of contrast to them. So I grabbed the Rusty Hinge Distress Oxide spray and I used the nozzle to just kind of splatter on a little bit of more concentrated orange on there. And these, I love them. I love them. You'll see. Okay, so I felt like I had enough here to get started and I could just add things as necessary. So you can see here, I'm kind of testing out how these will look on top of each other, and they do kind of get lost on each other. The busier pattern is too busy, the leaves get lost on it. The softer panels are the exact same as the leaf. So it's still, I was like, so here I'm like, okay, what if I mat them together? And here I was like, no, I don't like that. I could use a darker one, but I just really don't like that. I love the softness of this main leaf. So I was like, well, what if I swap these? So if I put the heavier pattern in the background and then I put the softer pattern here, the looser, on top. Now this is going to cover up a lot of that pattern that I created, but that's okay because I can see all of the color around the edges and it ties in beautifully. And I just picked one of the panels that I did not like as much as the others, right? It had maybe something on there that I didn't like, I didn't love. So we'll just use that one as a mat for this panel. So I went ahead and trimmed that down to 4¼ by 4¼ for the leaf pattern. Then for this top panel, it was 4 by 4. And I really liked the way this looked. I liked the way that there was continuity between the background and the leaf, but the leaf still stood out on top. I liked this subtlety, but I figured I could separate them just a little bit more if I added a little stamping to the background, and I wanted to incorporate some gold. Gold is a must for autumn as far as I'm concerned. So I grabbed another set in this release. This is illustrated by Kelly Taylor. This is the Autumn, let me see. This is the Autumn Beautiful Bounty stamp set. I grabbed that and I'm using a powder tool here to just treat my cardstock. I'm going to stamp that using some embossing ink, and then I'm going to heat emboss that with gold embossing powder. I'm going to do an offset here, so I'm going to stamp it in the lower left hand corner, and I'm going to use quite a bit of the image for this first impression, and this is going to make it a little bit heavier at the bottom. And then in the upper right-hand corner, I'm going to stamp just a smaller portion of the stamp set. And that's going to just accent it up there and carry that imagery across the card. But it's going to keep, like I said, the larger, heavier portion of the image is going to be at the bottom, and then a smaller, less visual heavy version at the top. And again, using those alternate corners is a great way to create balance. And by varying their visual weight, you get that symmetry, but it is not completely symmetrical. Okay, so now that we've heat embossed those florals, I wanted to extend these just a little bit. So I grabbed the Leaves Falling for You set and used one of the little berry segments to just extend the bouquets a little bit. This is just going to add a little bit of movement so the bouquets don't look like just corner clusters. It kind of extends them into the rest of the design a little bit. So now I'm going to take this over to my sewing machine and I'm going to add a zigzag stitch all the way around all four sides. And if I remember correctly, it was right about here that I started to struggle. I was having a hard time coming up with how to effectively create a little focal point here in the center where everything balanced each other well and each element kind of stuck out. So I decided to use a little bit of vellum here behind what would be my focal point. And I didn't want it to lay flat, so I did some ripping of the edges, and now I'm using my pokey tool here to roll some of the edges, and I really, really like the way that looked. So I decided to go ahead and do it in a couple more spots. Here at the bottom, I'm going to roll that as well. And this added a lot more dimensional texture to the card, and I liked that part. So I'm going to go ahead and glue that in place. But then I had a hard time with that central focal arrangement. I just could not get it to come together in a way that made sense to me. So when that happens, what I do is I kind of just put that to the side and I start continuing to build like the background. And I decided to add a little bit more stitching to my vellum. So I took that over to my sewing machine and added some zigzag stitching randomly at the top and the bottom here. And I really liked that. I liked how it repeated that stitching in the focal point area there, but it wasn't in your face. So it just kind of peeks out from behind the focal point. Then I thought, well, what if I add another layer of the vellum here and just kind of keep building this up? Because again, what I'm really trying to do here is keep being, I'm just trying to keep being productive while avoiding this central focal point because I can't figure out what to do with it at this point. So that's one thing. If you can't figure out what to do with something, focus on something else and eventually it might come together. So here I decided to work in some more of that embossing, that gold embossing. We've got it in the background panel there. So I was like, well, let me hit the edges of this vellum, this top piece of vellum with a little bit of gold embossing powder. So I inked the edges with some embossing ink and then I just kind of dipped the edges into my embossing powder and then I'm going to melt that and that's going to give me a little bit of that gold shine and just repeat that throughout the design. And it was at that point that I honed in on the gold. So we've got gold on the background panel. We've got gold here on this vellum, which is the backdrop for our focal point. And I was like, all right, let's work some gold into the focal point and maybe that will help me. So I grabbed those leaf die cuts here and those leaf die cuts and cut those from brushed gold cardstock. And this time I cut some of the smaller leaves. And I also decided just to use their outlines. Since the large leaf there was solid and I'm using the whole die cut, I decided to just use the outlines and I thought this perfectly mimicked the line art with the gold embossing from the stamping of the flowers in the background. So now it is starting to take shape. I added a nest of some thread there right behind our leaf cluster. And this I'm really happy with. So I'm going to go ahead and stamp out my sentiment. I'm going to use some brown ink for this. We're keeping with those warm tones. And you'll notice that I'm stamping this on that ink smushed panel that I created instead of stamping this on like clean white or even cream cardstock. Having that little bit of distressing color in the background is going to, it's going to marry the sentiment with the design a little bit better and keep it from looking out of place like this super clean sentiment sitting on top of all of this yummy vintage goodness. It just helps the sentiment look like part of the design and not like an afterthought. Speaking of afterthought, I wanted to add a little bit more of those loose threads, those nests there underneath the sentiment here. So I grabbed a little bit of the metallic gold thread and kind of bunched that up. And then I'm going to adhere that directly under our sentiment. And then finally, for the finishing touch, I'm bringing buttons back. I've made the statement before. Occasionally, I will throw them in there. But if you don't like buttons, don't add buttons. Maybe you like brads. Look, you can bring brads back. I'll bring buttons back. We won't judge each other, and everything will be great, right? Okay, finally, I did decide on a placement for these buttons, but we can review that in the finished card at the end. For now, let's jump into our second card. And this one came together much quicker than the first card because I already had those creative juices flowing. I had tried a lot of things in the first card that maybe weren't right for that card, but I knew could be used in another card. So we're going to utilize some of those here. I love these die cuts. I took the rest of the die cuts that I had left over, and we're going to create a faux all over pattern here on the background of a cream card panel. Now, I'm using liquid adhesive to adhere these. However, this is probably not the wisest way to do it. It works if that's all you have on hand. If you have a spray adhesive, that would be perfect. Just turn these all over, spray the backs, and then adhere them to your card front. Likewise, cutting them originally from cardstock that was backed with like a Picket or a thin double-sided adhesive would have been a good way to go as well. However, again, no plan when we started, so now it is what it is, and here we are. I'm using liquid adhesive. In the end, it worked, so there's that. Once they were all adhered, I flipped it over, trimmed off any excess, and that tag there is going to be my focal panel. And I chose that craft color there to add that contrast in early on, because I think that was really one of my sticking points when it came to creating the focal point last time, is I didn't have any contrast, which is where those gold die cuts came in. So this time we're going to work that contrast in right off the bat. Borrowing from our last design, I went ahead and die cut the Layering Flora Tall Wildflower die set from some of that remaining ink smushed paper, and then one from that brushed gold cardstock as well. So this, again, all coming from that previous card. Instead, we used the leaves. This time we're using those wildflower dies. Keeping with that soft distressed theme, I'm going to go ahead and distress this tag, but instead of using a brown, which would darken up the overall color scheme, I'm going to distress it with some white paint. This is Picket Fence Distress Paint, and we're just going to take a brush and kind of dry brush this around the edges. And then I'll even bring some of it up into the center as well. And I really like the way that this leaves that contrast between the panel and the tag, but it softens it just a little bit. So I've arranged those wildflower die cuts here in the center, and then I'm going to take some twine here, wrap it around the bottom, and tie it in a bow. I'll glue those pieces into place and trim off any excess. Now behind that, I wanted to add some more layers, so I grabbed out some old vintage book paper and ripped off a piece to layer behind my tag. And then I borrowed some of that same vellum idea from the first card, and we're going to layer these all together. So I'm going to go ahead and rip the edge. So I have this nice torn edge, fold up some of the areas, and then layer these two on top of each other and put them behind the tag. All right, so once those were adhered together, I needed to incorporate that gold in more places. So I'm going to go ahead and, oh, I must have cut something out. I'm just realizing that I cut out a step. Hold on, I'll tell you what I did there. So anyways, I inked the edges of the vellum and the paper here, dipped those into the embossing powder, and then I melted that. But you can also see in the background here, there's some splatters of gold embossing powder. I took a brush, dipped it in water, put some splatters across the background of that tag, and then just sprinkled heat embossing powder on it and emboss that in gold as well. So now I have the gold detail on that wildflower. I have some gold splatters on the back of the tag, and then I have that gold edging along the vellum. I adhered that tag to my panel using a little foam adhesive, and now I'm going to add some white splatters. So I've put down a little bit more of that Picket Fence distress paint. I'm using the fan brush here from Picket Fence Studios to do a little bit of splattering, and then I'm also going to use a little bit of gold, and I'm going to splatter that across the entire card as well. And then the only thing left to do would be add my sentiment and my buttons and adhere this to a card base. So let's go ahead and review both finished cards. And both of these cards are a perfect example of how your finished project may turn out drastically different than it looked like when you first started, because we started with that all over stamped panel, which really this border is the only part of that you can see. However, creating that panel with the color blends, the color palette, and the watercolor-like effect is really the starting point for all of these cards. All of the ideas evolved from there. One just kind of built or morphed from the other. So I really, really love how these cards turned out. I think it is, like I said, quite different from what you might have envisioned when you first watched me stamping out that panel. But had I not stamped out that large panel, I would not have ended up here because it was all a very organic graduation of ideas that culminated into these actually very light and airy cards. All of that to say, don't be afraid to just play with your products. I know I've been saying that a lot lately, but I figured it would be most impactful if you actually saw how I start off at one point and end up in a totally different space. So hopefully you guys enjoyed today's video. Hopefully you learned something. If you did, don't forget to give this a thumbs up. If you haven't already, make sure that you're subscribed so you don't miss any future videos. If you're looking for any of the featured products, they will be listed in the description box below. As always, I want to thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you next time. Bye.